Hey, Scott, how are you?
Well, I actually got shots today. Once in the chest, once in the face, once in the leg, and once in the back.
My God, who shot you?
Actually, we're in the middle of Songkran in Thailand at the moment. Probably one of the biggest water fights in the world. Everyone's armed with a water pistol. So I went out on my motorbike today. Got shot in the face, which can be a bit dangerous when you're riding a motorbike. But it was kind of funny, yeah. You know, once I got used to it, it's kind of funny. You know, you get people shooting at you from the side of the road. It's good actually. I quite liked it. I mean, I didn't buy a water pistol myself, but you know, people are armed with these kind of. They're not small water pistols. They're like, you know, heavy duty artillery kind of things.
Yeah, the kind of plastic AK-47 pump action water pistols.
That's right, yeah. Gone are the days of those small little hand pistols that we used to have when we were younger. These are sort of automatic loading, water pistols. So yeah, it's a good mood here in Thailand at the moment.
Did you ever witness the Bucket of Water festival in Ukraine? If you can call it a festival. Yeah, they hang out of their so if you've got a house or a shop or whatever with a balcony, you hang out of your balcony and drop buckets of water on people as they go by. It's mostly on, you know, the targets, the most frequent targets are young girls, of course, because, you know, Ukrainian men.
I know it's Easter in Ukraine at the moment, so people are busy eating eggs. And is that the same in Georgia?
Yeah, it's Easter here now. I'm in the Republic of Georgia, which is a very strange name actually. The actual name of the country is Sakartvelo, and so yeah, I'm here. It's it's a fairly zealously Orthodox country, and we're having Easter here at the moment. So lots of eggs boiled and coloured, and then you're supposed to duel with these eggs. So you go up to another person and you crack your eggs together, and one egg invariably breaks the other egg for some reason. I don't know why. And if your egg's broken, you're the loser, and you have to do some kind of forfeit.
Oh, nice.
So that's quite fun. Yeah.
So how have you been finding Georgia generally?
Oh, look, it's pretty good. The roads are an absolute nightmare. I was in a car accident yesterday. Not hurt, fortunately. No one was hurt, but I completely expected it, you know. I've been in the country for a week and already had one car accident, and I'm not even a little bit surprised, because they just are maniacs here. They really are. I thought the driving in Turkey was bad before I came here. But aside from that, it's good. People are lovely. I really like Georgian people.
Cool, yeah. I was going to say, actually, on the same subject, the downside to Songkran is the death toll goes up on the roads, apparently, through the amount of alcohol drunk. I thought it might be because of the water pistols being shot in the face like it was today, but no, it's apparently the amount of alcohol drunk during this period.
Yeah, that is a significant downside. There's a bit of a problem here with that as well, not surprisingly, seeing as how Georgia is all about the drinking. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But I was hearing from a local person in Tbilisi. Tbilisi is the capital city, by the way. It's where I am now. I was hearing from someone in Tbilisi that the police are often drunk as well. So there have been people pulled over for drunk driving by drunk police.
So everyone's drunk, basically.
Everyone is drunk. Yeah, but
I wonder how would a drunk policeman behave? Is that going to be beneficial, or is it more of a negative thing?
I don't know, but like if the guy pulled you out of the car and said walk along a straight line, it'd be really tempting to say, well, after you, officer. Yeah. But as I said, I've been here for a week, really enjoying it, and I wanted to tell you, on a more serious note, I suppose you could say, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Georgia and its recent history, and particularly in reference to this situation in Ukraine, because there are a lot of parallels. And look, it's been mentioned in the mainstream media a few times that some people in Eastern Europe are saying, and elsewhere, are saying that the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donetsk and Luhansk is sort of a repeat of what happened in Georgia, you know. So I wanted to kind of go through and clarify that a little bit. But to start with, basically Georgia is one of the 15 former Soviet republics, but it wasn't one of the kind of natural ones. By that I mean the people are absolutely unrelated ethnically to Russians or Ukrainians or anyone else. They're what's called a Kartelian culture. It got its independence after World War I, but then in 1921 the USSR invaded Georgia on Lenin's orders, in fact, and a year later they annexed it. So it was sort of dragged into the USSR against its will. Probably the most famous thing about Georgia is that Stalin was born here, and in fact what brought him to the attention of the Bolsheviks was his activities here in Tbilisi, the capital city. He was involved in some revolutionary activity, but more than that, he was primarily just a criminal. So
he wasn't exactly a nice chap, really, was he?
He wasn't, and that's why the Bolsheviks wanted him. In 1907, he coordinated a huge bank heist here, and he and the others got away with the equivalent of about $3.5 million. And this was a fundraiser for the Bolsheviks, right? But in the process, 40 people were killed, 50 people were injured. It was a huge bloodbath. And look, Lenin also had a role in it, a coordinating role. So the idea that, you know, he was sort of an idealistic man, you know, and Stalin sort of perverted the revolution, that idea is basically a fiction. They were robbing banks and killing people to raise money for their political party. You can actually visit Stalin's birthplace here in a town called Gori, and they show you like this huge museum detailing, you know, everything about his life, and then you go into a little one-room house where Stalin grew up, and it's a very strange experience because the museum guides don't really offer any comment on Stalin. I mean, nothing about his, you know, the devastation he caused or his legacy or anything like this. They just, you know, relate the facts of his life, and they show you a bunch of photographs and personal possessions and so on. And it's hard to know why there's this kind of this lack of comment. It could be because they actually are not ashamed of Stalin. I mean, some people say. So some people in former Soviet countries sort of focus away from, you know, his brutality and towards his achievements. And actually, it was Winston Churchill who said that, you know, Stalin took the country with the plow and left it with nuclear weapons, meaning that, you know, he oversaw like an incredible period of industrialization that modernized the country, and it was an enormous achievement. And it seems like a lot of people here are quite proud of that.
Would you say it's fair to say that a fairly large number of people in Slavic countries kind of admire strong leaders, even if that means that they kill a lot of people and have got a reputation for being cruel? They're kind of admired almost for that.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. There's a perception in Russia, for example, that Russia is ungovernable except by a strong man, you know, because it's so large and unruly and ethnically diverse and so on. There's about, I think, 170 different ethnicities in Russia, you know, some of them Orthodox, some of them Muslim, and so on. So the perception is that you need a strong leader to hold all of that together. And actually, I witnessed an argument about Stalin some time ago and about his legacy in Moscow. It was about 4 or 5 people who ganged up on this one person. She had said that Stalin was the best leader that Russia ever had, and they needed him back to fix the country's problems. So she was defending this position vigorously, and the others were saying he's a mass murderer and all that stuff. So yeah, it was quite interesting. But anyway, it's well known, I think, that Stalin was never really expected to take over the leadership of the Bolsheviks after Lenin died, because he just didn't seem to have the personal charisma, you know, and because nobody trusted him was another issue. Nobody in the party, and in fact, once Lenin worked out that he might take over, he wrote a letter to a bunch of other senior party figures, basically saying, "Don't let Stalin take over. It's a bad idea." So this is where the story takes on a little bit of a conspiracy flavor, you could say. There's evidence that Lenin and others wanted Stalin on board quite early on, you know, before the revolution, because of this, you know, fundraising ability that he had. In other words, he was a cunning criminal. And basically, they needed money. They needed to raise funds for their party. So, in the same way that your politicians of today in countries like the US are chosen for their personal wealth or their ability to raise funds, like, you know, Obama, Romney, Hillary Clinton, whatever.
By the way, just to interrupt, Hillary Clinton has just announced her 2016 presidential campaign. Fox News alerts.
Scott, I'm shocked. I'm utterly shocked.
Bet you didn't expect that.
How can another member of the Clinton dynasty run for election?
It's criminal.
It is. But you know, all those guys, as we know, I mean, the whole political process there has been corrupted by fundraising, and it was the same with the Russian Revolution. And so they took on a very shady character in Stalin because of his ability to raise money, which is, you know, a scary thought, really. But so anyway, Georgia went through the same periods of, you know, purges and gulags and so on that all the other republics did. But then when the Soviet Union fell apart and they got their independence, the country collapsed, like, totally and pretty much immediately. They elected their own leader, but then he was deposed and replaced with a guy called Eduard Shevardnadze, who was previously Gorbachev's foreign minister, so he participated in the end of the Soviet Union, so to speak. And under this guy Shevardnadze, Georgia just became completely overwhelmed with corruption and organized crime and so on, and the population just fell into poverty. So like most of the ex-Soviet republics, it was a pretty horrible place to be in the 1990s, which, you know, partly explains why you do run across so many people in this republic who say that the Soviet period was better than the current period. The USSR had a certain stability about it. You know, there was full employment, there was no homelessness, there was a pretty good education system and so on. Whereas now, by all accounts, in Georgia, the primary and secondary education systems are quite good, but there are no universities of any note. And so, yeah, looking back to those times, you know, people were poor, but everybody had the basics, you know, a roof over their head, access to education, things like this. And you certainly can't say that about the former Soviet republics today. Although, I wanted to tell you a little story. I heard this story last night from I've been staying with a family in Tbilisi, and the daughter of the family, Tasia, told me this story. Her grandfather bought a car, and he was arrested for buying the car.
He was arrested for buying a car?
He was arrested for buying a car.
Why?
Well, the authorities, of course, knew exactly how much money that he was earning. He worked in a factory, and they reasoned that on his factory wages he couldn't afford to buy the car, so they arrested him.
And what was his explanation for how he could afford the car?
He'd been saving the money. He really wanted a car, so he saved up his money.
What a criminal!
So I asked him. Yeah, I know. So I asked Tasia, so, you know, what happened? Did he go to prison? He was in custody for 1.5 years while they were sorting out how he managed to buy his car, right? This is the level of the, you know, inefficiency. It'd be like, just wait there for 3 months while we try and find out whether I really think you did this. And then, so I asked, what happened to the car? And she was like, the car was in our garage the whole time. We kept the car. So, just, crazy times.
Strange way of life.
Yeah, really. So in the first few years of this century, you saw huge protests in Georgia against Shevardnadze and the corruption and so on. And eventually, that culminated in what was called the Rose Revolution in 2003. And in that revolution, the Georgian people effectively ousted Shevardnadze. He agreed to, walk away, basically. And they installed a new president, a guy called Mikhail Saakashvili. Sorry. We'll talk a bit more about Saakashvili because he really has shaped the country. And the Rose Revolution actually has quite a bit of relevance to stuff that's happening today. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about how Georgia is regarded in the other ex-Soviet republics. Basically, Georgians have the reputation of being sort of the bon vivants of the former USSR, and part of that is because the country makes a pretty credible claim to being the birthplace of wine. I'm stealing that phrase from various tourist leaflets and travel books and so on. But you can see wine presses here that are like 5,000 years old, and there are ancient pagan temples all over the country where you have like the big sun goddess temple, and then you have clear evidence that wine was involved in their religion.
Are you able to get your hands on a 5,000-year-old bottle of wine?
I wasn't, no, but I did jump into one of the wine presses, the 5,000-year-old wine press. It was actually made of solid rock carved into the side of a mountain.
Is that where you're doing your report from at the moment?
Yes. I'm sitting here bathing in wine up to the neck.
You couldn't actually escape.
What's that?
You couldn't escape from this wine press.
Couldn't escape, no. Also about a quarter of the world's grape varieties are actually native to Georgia. So wine is huge here, and it always has been.
What's your verdict on the wine?
I love Georgian wine. It's great. There are any number of varieties that I could recommend, but the thing that makes it really distinctive is the way that it's produced. So they generally produce it in huge clay pots or vats called krevri, and sometimes they lime these with beeswax before they put the wine in. So the taste is very unique. They also have another color of wine, by the way. So there's red and there's white, and then there's another color which is amber, and that's like white grapes which are aged along with the skins. So the skins change the flavor and the color, and when you look at this wine, like amber is the perfect word to describe it. It looks exactly like amber. So yeah, I guess I'm taking a suitcase full of Georgian wines back with me to Turkey.
This Rose Revolution, was that connected to rosé wine at all?
Why was that? It's because a lot of the protesters were carrying roses when they protested. Tbilisi has a population of 1 million, and the biggest protests involved 250,000 people standing in Freedom Square, which is not far from here. So a quarter of the city's population came out to protest with roses. Yeah, but apart from wine, and this is, I hope this won't sound too cruel here to our friends in Russia and Ukraine, but in those countries, Georgian food's pretty much the tastiest stuff around. About a decade ago, I spent a year living in Moscow, and whenever a group of expats would go out for a meal there, they'd be far more likely to go to a Georgian place than a Russian place, because Georgia just has this amazing culinary tradition, right? And really, it's hard to say the same thing about Russia. The culinary traditions there are, let's say, quite specific to the Russian palate.
Well, the shashlik's not bad.
But shashlik is not Russian. Shashlik comes from the Caucasus, of which Georgia is a part. And a lot of Georgian foods have become staples for other Soviet peoples too. Even like in Odessa, when you go to the markets, you get those huge round loaves of soft bread. They're Georgian, and if you compare them to Ukrainian bread, I mean, Ukrainian bread's actually, I think, more useful as a building material than as a food. So yeah. Plus, anything with a bit of spice in it that you encounter in Russia or Ukraine, like adjika, the red pepper sauce, for example. That's all from Georgia and the Caucasus. Also,
better stop now, Anthony, or you won't be allowed back into Ukraine.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, the FSB is probably adding this to my file as we speak. I'm telling you all this stuff about food and wine for a specific reason. Before I get to that, though, let's go back to the Rose Revolution. After Mikhail Saakashvili became the new president of Georgia, he started on these massive government cleanup programs, and in particular, he decided to tackle corruption. And I mean, this was a really big effort, and some rare good news about corruption from the former Soviet Union. He sacked pretty much the entire police force, for one thing, and created a new one. And look, he definitely didn't fix Georgia's economy entirely. There was still tons of stupid bureaucracy that affected public works, and there's tons of that. And the safety regulations in Georgia are non-existent. I was talking to a British engineer there, who's involved in a dam building project, and he just says that safety regulations are crazy because there's so much Soviet-style bureaucracy where you have to conform to certain standards, but those standards are actually far below international standards, but they're different. So you can't make things as safe as they could be because of this bureaucracy. So he didn't fix the country entirely, and there's still lots of poverty there now, especially in the rural parts. But at the same time, all these Saakashvili reforms, they did go a long way towards addressing at least some of Georgia's problems, and getting the country back on its feet. And the thing is, as far as I know, that sort of program doesn't really have any parallels in any of the other former Soviet republics. People in most of those republics were facing similar levels of corruption, and it was just crippling their economies. So when they saw what happened here in Georgia, some of those people started agitating for change in their own countries. Then in 2004, so 1 year after the Rose Revolution, this Ukrainian politician called Viktor Yanukovych, maybe you remember him, Scott.
I think I do, yeah.
So he rigged the national elections in Ukraine.
Well, that's not like him.
No, it's not. And he got himself elected as president. As you know, Yanukovych was what the media usually calls a pro-Kremlin candidate. He was all about maintaining strong ties with Russia and keeping Ukraine within the Russian sphere of influence and so on. And of course that necessarily involves doing business the Russian way, which means that your entire economy runs on kickbacks in exchange for loyalties and various other forms of corruption. So after that election in 2004, the people of Ukraine protested on a huge scale, just like in Georgia the previous year. I mean, most of the protesters were from the western part of the country, which is historically, anti-Russian anyway. And there was a certain amount of evidence that they got some backing from the West, possibly even from the CIA. But there were dissenting voices all over the country because people were just, furious with the falsified election results, and they were just tired of seeing public money in Ukraine disappearing, and getting no public services in return. I mean, you've seen the roads there; they're in a shocking state, and the same with everything else, be it schools, hospitals, whatever. So that protest movement succeeded, and in the end, the election was rerun, and the results were overturned, and Yanukovych lost. And that became known as the Orange Revolution. Now, the thing to note here is that although you wouldn't call it the decisive influence, there were certainly a lot of people in Ukraine who had the Rose Revolution in the backs of their minds, and they'd seen that a mass movement could force a corrupt government out of power. So it was definitely a kind of source of inspiration for the people on the Maidan in Kiev in 2004. But unfortunately, other people also noticed these parallels, and one of them was Vladimir Putin. Then, a year later, you had another government overthrown in Kyrgyzstan, also a former Soviet republic. And the Kyrgyz people started calling their movement the Tulip Revolution. So, to be honest, without knowing all the details of what happened there, politics in Kyrgyzstan usually doesn't bear much resemblance to a field full of swaying tulips. It's more like a field full of landmines, And also, tulips almost certainly come from Kazakhstan, not Kyrgyzstan. But anyway, a lot of these people who we sometimes call Russia watchers were watching Putin very closely around that time, after the success of 3 mass protest movements. And the general consensus was that he was just mightily freaked out by this. Some people have said that he's worried a similar thing might happen in Russia, and others say that he just didn't want to lose control over so many neighbors, because at that point the Eurasian Customs Union was starting to kind of ramp up, and the Eurasian Customs Union was Putin's idea of a kind of ex-Soviet counterbalance to the EU, and he wanted everyone to be in it. So, he wanted all the Central Asian stands, he wanted the Caucasian republics like Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, and of course he wanted Ukraine and Belarus. Now, in the early 1990s, when Georgia was going through the post-Soviet collapse, 2 of its regions broke away. One was called Abkhazia, and the other one was South Ossetia. In 2008, Saakashvili, who was elected by the Rose Revolution, tried to get South Ossetia back. So he sent some forces in there to reclaim South Ossetia as part of Georgia, and the Russian government's response was to declare a full-scale war on Georgia and invade. And one of their justifications was doing that was that they said they had an obligation to protect ethnic Russians in North Ossetia who were being persecuted there. Now, that seems like a fairly silly argument and irrelevant detail, but it becomes very important later because we've heard that argument again much more recently in Ukraine. So Russia took back North Ossetia, and then they officially acknowledged the other breakaway territory, Abkhazia, as a separate nation. Though almost no other country on earth has done that. I think there are 3 others who've done it. The last one was Nauru. so Nauru recognizes Abkhazia. And then the Putin government started essentially creating economic ties to this tiny little Abkhazian republic. And these ties were so strong they pretty much became the only lifeline of the republic. I mean, there's maybe 500,000 people living there, so it's a tiny, tiny place. And they started propping it up with aid, which they still do. So they created, if you like, what you might call a docile client state. Yeah. And at the same time, Moscow came down really hard on Georgia. So, I mentioned before about the wine, which is one of the country's main exports. And of course, just north of Georgia, there are 150 million Russians, and they don't have much of a wine growing tradition of their own because the climate isn't really suited to it. So Russia was by far the biggest market for Georgian wine growers. But in 2008, Putin banned imports of Georgian wine, which really hurt the economy here. There were other bans too, but that was kind of the most powerful one. Now, if you read the press here, they're squabbling over cheese. But
cheese and wine do actually go together quite nicely.
Well, they do. There's a bit of a thing. The Russians are now creating a cheese called Sulguni, and that's a Georgian name. So it's a bit like other people creating wine and calling it champagne. That's all happening at the moment. But so here again, there's been a lot of speculation about why Putin has been running such a strongly anti-Georgian policy, and part of it was probably just to do with the fact that Saakashvili was so pro-Western and he was so vocal about it. He also snubbed Putin a few times. Like in 2006, here there was a museum of Soviet occupation opened in Tbilisi, and Putin complained to Saakashvili about it in person. He said, this is pure propaganda. And he also pointed out, truthfully, that several of the people most responsible for Soviet repression, namely Stalin and his chief of security, Lavrenti Beria, so they were both Georgian. And a lot of the blood in Soviet history is on their hands. So Putin said this to Saakashvili, how can you open this museum? Beria and Stalin were Georgian. And Saakashvili said, oh, fine, well, if you like, we can offer you some funds to help you set up a museum of Georgian occupation in Moscow. And then he went out into the press and said, look, if anybody's taking personal offense to this museum, that's their problem, meaning Putin, obviously. So, this isn't the kind of thing that generally endears you to Vladimir Putin. And incidentally, that museum became controversial again in 2007, the Museum of Soviet Occupation, because Viktor Yushchenko visited it. He was the president of Ukraine at the time. So he visited the Georgians' Museum of Soviet Occupation, and he commented that there should be a similar one in Ukraine, which again just made people's blood boil in Moscow.
Well, also, wasn't Stalin linked to the Holodomor in Ukraine as well?
Yes, yeah, exactly. The famine of the 30s. There's a whole bunch of theories as to exactly what his connection was, but at the very least, it was related to the 5-year plans and the ineptitude of those 5-year plans that caused the famine in Ukraine. But then there's another theory, popular in the West Ukraine, that it was a deliberate policy to try to starve Ukrainians to death. And I don't believe that we will ever know the truth of that, but at the very least, it makes him, if you kill, 7 million people, is that right?
I'm not sure, but
7 million people die. Quite a lot. So if you, as the premier of a nation state, manage to kill 7 million of your citizens, that pretty much makes you one of the worst leaders of all time, right there. So, yeah. But look, apart from that, one idea about why Putin has moved so strongly against Georgia is that it's meant to be a show of force to the other ex-Soviet republics. So if you go back a bit further to late 1990s, Russia tried and really wanted to play a role in resolving the Kosovo crisis in the Balkans. So Kosovo, I guess many listeners will remember, Kosovo was a province of Serbia that was largely controlled by ethnic Albanians, and they wanted to declare independence, but for various reasons the Serbs were not going to let them. They wanted to retain this province in their country. Now that's a huge story in itself, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about at some future time. But just sticking to the subject here, historically Serbia has always been Russia's closest ally in Europe. I mean, we're talking about centuries of very kind of warm, almost brotherly relations, and from what I've been together, these are genuinely felt by ordinary Russians and Serbs, the sense of brotherhood of between the two nations. So in 1998, while Boris Yeltsin was the Russian president, of course he wanted to participate in this Kosovo settlement, but at that time the country was extremely weak. I mean, Russia was extremely weak economically. Its military was a total mess, and in terms of international affairs, nobody wanted to hear Russia's opinion. So NATO and the US just completely ignored Yeltsin and Yeltsin's advisors, and they signed all the relative treaties without consulting Russia. And of course, that was taken as a direct slap in the face, because basically it was. and it's in hindsight, it was a huge mistake on the part of Western powers, which is now having real world consequences. There's absolutely no doubt that Putin felt extremely angry about the Kosovo issue, and he still does, and we know this because almost every time he makes a speech about how treacherous the West is, he brings up Kosovo. I mean, barely a month goes by, but see, between around 2003 and 2008, Russia had spent a lot of money and a lot of effort rebuilding its military, and there's a theory which I think has some merit to it, and which goes like this. Basically, the fact that Russia was so totally ignored in Kosovo showed to the other ex-Soviet republics that they could ignore it too. They could do whatever they want. So that emboldened people to try and push for change in those countries, even if the change would go against Russian interests. And then you had your revolutions, your rose, your tulip, your orange, and so on. So for Putin and his soul, the revolutions just underlined the fact that nobody was scared of Russia anymore. And he decided to use Georgia as the place to show these other former Soviet states that, we've rebuilt the army and we're back.
Just a quick advert break. Our email is scottsentinel9@gmail.com. Check out our past episodes. We've got lots of interesting guests, and you can find us on YouTube on 2 channels. We talk about conspiracies, mysteries, injustices, corruption, religion, war, peace. You can leave your own message and we can base our show around what you think. That's what we intend to do. You can find our website on Google. Just type in Truth Sentinel Scott and WIX and it will come up. You can find latest episodes there. You can help us find the truth hidden deep within mainstream media. Find our YouTube channels. We've got all the episodes on there. Truth Sentinel and Truth Sentinel 1. Subscribe to both so you get notified of everything. Click on the About section, you'll find all the links. We've also teamed up with trutht-shirts.com, and they make political t-shirts. Let people know where you stand, basically. Use the code TRUTH1, you get a 10% discount, and we get a donation. They make all kinds of political t-shirts, and they can customize them for you as well. If you've got any ideas for publicity stunts, get in contact. We need to escalate this channel, make it much bigger. We need your help. Please support us. Thank you.
Now, 2 years after that, so 2010, we saw elections again in Ukraine. And Scott, you remember this because you're there. I was there with you. After the Orange Revolution, we know that the pro-Western president was Viktor Yushchenko, and his prime minister was Yulia Tymoshenko. And the thing with those guys was that they'd come into office promising 2 big things. First, they wanted Ukraine to move closer to Europe. And ultimately, they wanted to put together a bid for EU membership. That was the first promise. And second, they were going to end corruption, just like Saakashvili had done in Georgia. But in fact, Yushchenko turned out to be completely useless in that regard. And Tymoshenko was arguably just as corrupt as any of the people she'd replaced or who she was meant to be fighting. In fact, she earned the nickname the Oil Princess because of all the shady deals that she did in the oil and gas sector, and also because she had that ridiculous hairstyle that looked like Princess Leia from Star Wars.
I quite liked it, actually.
So we had this person promising to end corruption, who was just signing $1 billion backroom deals herself. So then, in the 2010 elections, Yushchenko and Tymoshenko were beaten. But not only that, they were beaten by Viktor Yanukovych, who was the same guy who'd been kicked out in the Orange Revolution. And this time he actually seems to have won the vote, fair and square. Now, that Yanukovych victory was widely seen as a vote of no confidence in Yushchenko and Tymoshenko. But some analysts have said there may have been something else in it. It may have also shown how people have been pretty much given up on trying to resist the Russian influence in their internal affairs and kind of resigned themselves to their fate as being part of Russia's sphere of influence. So if there's any truth to that, then again you've got another Georgia-Ukraine connection here, because in the war with Georgia, the Kremlin had shown that it was, powerful again, and it could fuck up any adjacent country who tried to pull away. And on top of that, the ex-Soviets had seen that, even if they made a point of cozying up to the West, like Saakashvili did, Western countries wouldn't intervene if Russia decided to take military action. So, as I said, they invaded Georgia in 2008, and people in the US agonized over it, but ultimately did nothing and let Putin get away with it. So, it's hard to say for sure, but there may have been an element of this in Yanukovych's victory in 2010, because it just seemed unlikely that a politician who'd been so thoroughly disgraced, in the previous election, would end up being voted in and run the country. So,
yeah, I think.
So with all of that in mind,
I think in some ways, Ukraine is similar to a lot of other countries worldwide, really. Even our own countries, perhaps, in that people have very low expectations of what they can expect from a leader of their country, and they resign themselves to the fact that this is the way things are, and they prefer some kind of stability, even if it's corrupt stability.
Yeah, and you heard a lot of that last year after the Maidan in Ukraine. Well, Yanukovych made him corrupt, but at least we had stability. Well, yeah, okay, but what kind of stability was it? And yeah, you're right. I mean, there's some people in America who are fuming about the whole campaign contributions regime, but there are plenty of people who just go, yeah, what can you do?
Yeah, some people feel if they can just get on with their lives, if they're allowed to get on with their lives, and they can be left alone to a certain extent, they don't care really what else is going on, in government, any corruption or any dodgy deals internationally. But I think it's kind of a shame, because the world could be so much better. If we had decent people in power, the world could be so much better. Just incredible, I think. And I think people just don't want to take that risk. They don't, the Maidan, although it had, although there was definitely some people who had really good intentions, and people did win corruption, it hasn't turned out very well, really, has it?
No, well, that's right. And to a certain extent, I really noticed when I was living in Russia, what you're talking about here is that people just went, politics, we've got to get on with our lives. Who can be worried about politics? And to a certain extent, they're right, because there's not really much you can do about Putin, unfortunately. But, as you said, on the Maidan, last year, people were there for a whole variety of reasons. Not all of them were that noble. You had some fairly unsavory types there, and even some scary fascist bastards. But they were very much in the minority. In fact, truth be told, the People's Republic of Donetsk actually had more fascist potentials, at least in its early days, because it was being run at first by Alexander Borodai. That guy. He was a Russian who was, brought in for the purpose of running this breakaway republic, and he definitely had some nasty little connections to the Russian neo-Nazi movement. Whether those connections were still live last year or whether they were in his past, we don't know. But certainly, if there were any fascists in Ukraine last year, he'd be one of the ones you'd have to put on the top of your list of suspects.
Yeah, I think that fascist Nazi kind of story is definitely completely bogus. There's Nazi sentiments. You can find it all across Ukraine, really. Obviously not everyone. I'm not saying that at all, but there's definitely racist and some Nazi sympathisers across different parts of Ukraine, and so it's wrong to say that this was they were heavily involved in this revolution, and that there was any danger to Russians.
That's right. It's an invention of Russian media. You have to evaluate their claims in context, and part of the context is that a lot of statistics released in the last 5 years or so suggest that approximately 50% of all the neo-Nazi skinheads in the world live in Russia. That's the first thing. And the second thing, we know for sure that Pravy Sector and Svoboda, who are the far-right, somewhat fascistic elements in Ukrainian political culture, they ran in the elections last May and they got less than 2% of the vote. So there's not a lot of support for these far-right policies in Ukraine, regardless of what Russia One and RT and so on will tell you. The support for them isn't there.
And it hardly seems likely that someone like Vladimir Putin would look at those kind of people and think, these nasty people. He wouldn't give two hoots.
Yeah.
He wouldn't give two hoots, because if he did, he would stamp out the Nazi sympathisers, the ultra-right people in Russia that have killed Asians, and it seemed like the government turned a bit of a blind eye to some of the things that was going on there, killing Kazakhs and Asians in Russia.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And on top of that, there's all the evidence of ties between the Putin regime and far-right movements in EU countries and so on. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But look, I think one thing that motivated a lot of the Maidan protesters was again wanting to get rid of the systematic corruption in Ukraine. because all the corruption that we were talking about earlier had just spiraled completely out of control under Yanukovych. Ukraine was corrupted before Yanukovych came to power, but it intensified under his leadership to the point where it was, Ukraine was, there's a Transparency International index of the amount of transparency in countries around the world, and if you're lower on that list, it means your country is more corrupt. And Ukraine was falling under Yanukovych. It was falling below countries like Nigeria, for example.
That is pretty... It takes something to go below Nigeria for corruption.
Yeah. And look, people were just sick of it, because it was killing the country. I mean, I think we've said before in this show, 20 years ago, Poland's economy and Ukraine's economy were roughly the same size. Whereas now, Poland's economy is 4 times as big as Ukraine's. And one of the main reasons for that is corruption. And look, I know this is going off on a bit of a tangent, but I want to qualify that a little because when we talk about corruption, the concepts behind it are, I think, often a bit vague and non-specific. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how it typically worked. And I want to talk about the health sector. In 2013, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health bought a fleet of 1,400 new ambulances, right? And the list prices had been inflated by about 50%, which was a markup of about 8,000 British pounds on each ambulance. Now, the cost of things like ambulances comes partly out of the state budget and partly from hospital budgets. So what happened there was the supplier of the ambulance gave the Ukrainian government their list price. The Ukrainian government pushed that price up and then passed it on to hospitals. So the supplier received the actual sum of money that they quoted. The other 50%, the markup, disappeared to the pockets of government officials. And in this case, we're talking about more than £10 million on one deal, right? Mm-hmm. And that was true in every area of the economy under Yanukovych, but it was particularly bad in the field of medicine. So there were similar markups on things like respirators and in other kinds of life support systems. And in the cases of specific pieces of hospital equipment, they're paid for out of hospital budgets. But see, here's where the system was really bent. The hospitals pay for them, but the government chooses the suppliers. And so a lot of the contracts were allegedly signed government offices rather than in hospitals. And that's where the inflated prices would come from. So the hospitals were told how much they had to pay, and they knew it was too much, but they really didn't have a lot of choice. They could refuse and then not get the equipment, which was in some cases potentially life-saving, or they could try to make up the shortfall. And the way to do that is squeeze bribes out of patients. Now, Scott, you and I have both been in Ukraine hospitals. You know how much money changes hands in those places, yeah?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And most of the time it's gone under the table rather than over it, and it's gone from patients to doctors. But we know part of the reason for that is because doctors are chronically underpaid. Yeah, you're taking home $200 or $300 a month maximum, and you have to live. So as a doctor in Ukraine, you are going to take some of that under the table money. I
just have to give a little anecdote here. When I was in hospital in Lviv due to the swine flu epidemic, there was a doctor standing at the end of my bed, and a representative from my school said, "How long will he have to stay here?" And the doctor said, "As long as he's got some money."
Oh, that's hilarious. My school administrator in Moscow had a bribe budget, so I had a bad accident in Moscow and I ended up in a wheelchair. I fractured an ankle, and before they would treat me, they shut me out of the doctor's office, and my school administrator passed over his monthly bribe budget to the doctor, and then I got like top-line treatment. But yeah, that's how it works. Hospital administrators are also collecting some of his gross. So the doctors are taking some money from you as patients, and some of that goes into their own pockets, but the rest goes into the whole budget to pay for the equipment. So then, if you think about it, that's a direct money trail. It goes from the pockets of taxpayers to the government, and then a certain portion of it goes to the suppliers of the equipment, and the rest goes into the offshore bank accounts of crooked government officials. And like I said, that's what it's like right throughout the economy. And to be honest, I don't know if that much has changed in the last year. I know that the new Ukrainian health minister, whose name I've temporarily forgotten, this was one of his main, missions. It's certainly for arguments. It was certainly one reason so many people on Maidan last year, which I think is fair enough. So then we had we had the Maidan, and then Yanukovych fled. We still don't really know where he is.
He's completely disappeared, isn't he? Not. I don't think I've seen any TV appearances or anything.
Maybe he played Match 370.
I think he must have done. Who knows what's up to? Yeah, maybe he's changing his identity or something.
Yeah, well, I think that's very possible. In fact, I mean, it sounds very Cold War and what have you, but I do think that kind of thing happens.
I wonder if we'll ever hear from him again.
I don't know. And by the way, we should talk about, on another episode, we should talk about the snipers on the Maidan, because the beginning of this year, some evidence emerged that was really surprising. I didn't see this coming at all. It seems like at least some of the people shooting on the Maidan, when the whole thing really blew up, and there was that day where almost 100 people got killed. And it seemed that it was Yanukovych's orders for the police to start shooting, and then of course there was a conspiracy theory on the pro-Russian side that Maidan protesters were doing shooting. So all of that, last year, and then at the beginning of this year there was evidence that came out that there may have been a third group of people,
shooting both
neither
sides.
the police nor the protesters, who were shooting at both sides to provoke a firefight.
No, I heard that as well,
really,
and I think it does sum up exactly what's going on in Ukraine. Complete chaos, really. I mean, it's calm out now, but yeah, I mean, you've got all kinds of different people trying to confuse the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, we saw Russia's annexation of Crimea, and here again, Putin used this excuse that he used in Georgia and South Ossetia, that ethnic Russians in the region were in danger and they were being persecuted. And believe me, when he said, it really freaked out some of Russia's other neighbors, because they'd heard it before, during the South Ossetia Georgia standoff. It was starting to seem like something that Putin might use as an excuse in all sorts of places, In particular, it really worried the Latvians, because they've got a large minority Russian population. It's something like 5%. And when the war in Donetsk and Luhansk started, we did hear the same thing. Putin declared again, Russia has to intervene to protect its diaspora in eastern Ukraine, to send aid to ethnic Russians who are, ill or injured or whatever. But then last November, something happened that wasn't widely reported in the West. Putin was suddenly here in the media in Georgia, shaking hands with the leader of Abkhazia, the little province that broke off in the 90s. The leader of Abkhazia, by the way, is also a former KGB officer like Putin, so he's in a pod. But they were in an agreement that would effectively establish a joint Russian-Abkhazian military force. Now, in Georgia, a lot of people saw that as a step towards Russia annexing Abkhazia, and that would be a big problem for a number of reasons. One is just freedom of movement, which is an issue of constant protest in Georgia. I met a couple of months ago a guy from Abkhazia, from a city called Sukhumi, and he moved to Tbilisi 23 years ago, and I asked him, when was the last time you went back to visit your hometown? And he said, I've never been back. And I said, why? He said, because they won't let me. So if Abkhazia becomes part of Russia, the Georgians say, this will strand people apart from their families. They won't be able to go visit relatives and things like this, because Russia is making it, Putin is making it very difficult for Georgians to get into that part of the world, regardless of whatever, family ties or whatever else they have. So as the Georgians see it, in 2008, Putin shaved off part of Georgia, and then at the end of 2014, he moved to make Abkhazia part of Russia. There were big protests here in Tbilisi, tens of thousands of people in the streets. But I don't think too many people noticed it, because so much other horrible shit was going on at the end of last year. And so that's basically where we are at the moment. There's an ongoing standoff. I think hostilities could flare up again at pretty much any time.
Well, what will cause them to flare up? Probably some kind of intervention or some kind of provocative move by the West. I would have thought, the EU, Europe, England, America.
Well, it's very possible for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, like when Putin acted in 2008, when he invaded Georgia, there was a lot of soul searching about that, in Western countries. We thought this guy was our guy, and now he's turned out to be a monster, and should we go in and stop him? And in the end, nothing happened. But since then we've seen Ukraine, and if Putin tried to invade Georgia again, we might see slightly more resolve from the West to try and stop that happening. In terms of the Abkhaz people, they are actually a separate people. They got a really good deal in the Soviet Union. The Soviets said, let's join Georgia and Abkhazia together. They were separate before that. This was in the 20s. Let's join them together with equal status, and we'll make them one republic, right? And so the Abkhaz people went, all right, yeah, fair enough. And so they all went into the Soviet Union together, and then after they'd signed all those agreements, and then the Soviets downgraded Abkhazia to a region of Georgia. So that's where the problem came from. So, again, like all this, the kind of border playing in the 20s and 30s.
Another thing I wanted to mention was another similarity between the Georgia and Ukraine situation, which we're seeing develop now, is from 2002 to 2009, according to a little bit of research I did, Georgia received $693 million from the US. So that involved buying military vehicles, radios, surveillance and detection equipment, and we're seeing that as well in the Ukraine. You've got the US have agreed a budget to help train the Ukrainian army. The same with the UK as well, of investing money in that.
Yeah, and I mean in Georgia, and I think this is also parallel. In Georgia, you'll find a lot of voices who are, very enthusiastic about that and pushing for more. They're saying like they've got mobile missile launchers in Crimea that could deliver nukes to Romania. This is the kinds of things they're saying. So get in there now and destroy them, America. Yeah.
Is there anything you would say we can learn about what's going to happen next from the Georgia situation, or are they both about the same kind of result, or did something else happen in Georgia that we can say that's what's going to happen next in Ukraine?
I think the Abkhazia situation is quite illuminating, because as I said, they broke away in 92, 93. And by degrees, Russia has absorbed that territory and made it impossible for any kind of reconciliation to take place between Abkhazia and Georgia. So in fact, under Yeltsin, Yeltsin favored the Georgians quite heavily, and Putin reversed the policy. So pretty much as soon as he became president, he offered Russian passports to the Abkhaz, and then he took Georgia down a few pegs in 2008, and he acknowledged Abkhazia as a country, and now he's said that they want to have a joint military with Russia. So the strategy is, over time you split territory off, and then over time you absorb it into your own territory. And Putin's playing the long game in that way. I mean, that process that I just described has happened over the course of a decade and a half, and we might see a similar thing in Ukraine.
Well, he's already done it with Crimea, though, hasn't he?
Yeah, but Crimea was a bit of a special case because I don't know if your listeners know this or not. I assume that some of them do, but Crimea was given as a gift to the Ukraine back when it was the Ukraine. It was given to them as a gift by a Russian president during the Soviet Union, and actually that was done for fairly pragmatic reasons. There's a land bridge between Crimea and Ukraine. There's no land bridge between Crimea and Russia. So Russia is now propping up the Crimean economy to the tune of several billions of dollars a year, and doing the same, by the way, in Abkhazia. Abkhazia could not survive without aid from Russia. They just don't produce enough. So Russia seems willing to throw billions of dollars into these territories, and what the two of them have in common, Crimea and Abkhazia, is that they both have a coast on the Black Sea. So I think that's very illuminating. But yeah, we may see that eventually that the territories of eastern Ukraine are absorbed into Russia, but it will happen by slow steps, and Putin will continue to deny that he wants to do it up to a certain point, and then start to change his rhetoric, and then he'll do it. I think that's very useful.
Also, I mean, I heard from, I think I mentioned to you, from a security source that he said that Putin was likely to attack other cities soon. I hope it's not true, because I'm planning to go back to Odessa next month. But what do you think? Do you reckon that's likely or not?
I don't know. Look, it wouldn't fit the strategy. I think that would be overreach. He's quite good, I think, at knowing how much territory he can shave off at one time.
He's not getting any younger, is he?
No, he isn't. But he's had the Russian constitution changed to give himself another 10 years in power. And again, like one Georgian person I was talking to, I've had a lot of great conversations in the last week. Georgians are very, very chatty and friendly people, and the subject inevitably turns to politics, because the war there is only 7 years ago. Yeah, one Georgian guy that I was talking to, he said, this is basically what's going to happen. But I think, I don't know. I think that if I was in either Moldova or possibly Latvia, I'd be worried. I don't think that Putin would invade Latvia, but I don't think it's out of the question either. And certainly there are an awful lot of people in Latvia who are living in fear now of that very thing, because it has become a policy. In the case of Moldova, of course, you've got the breakaway territory of Transnistria, and that is a prime candidate for being absorbed into Russia next, I think, which means Russia will have a wedge of land between Ukraine and Romania, which is an EU country. So, yeah, I think we might see things like this occurring in the future. I think Putin will continue with his policy.
Don't worry though, Anthony, because if Hillary Clinton gets into power, then she'll manage to sort it all out and resolve any tensions.
She loves to trash talk Putin, doesn't she? But she's never really done anything. I mean, she's never done anything that has affected his policy in the least. So, yeah, who knows? Before we finish, I just want to mention one more thing. It's about language. When I came here, I was a little surprised by the fact that everybody speaks Russian. I assumed that because of the difficult history between Russia and Georgia, nobody would want to speak to me in Russian. I mean, I've never been a completely a fluent speaker, and of course I live in Turkey now, so I don't get much chance to practice. But I can have a conversation and get by. But here, I just figured it wouldn't be very well received, but I was completely wrong. In fact, nobody seems to have a problem with it at all. And when people realise I'm a foreigner, if they don't speak English, lots of them, immediately ask, "Вы говорите по-русски? Do you speak Russian?" Right? So that was a little unexpected. Now, I mention that because it contrasts so sharply with the situation in Western Ukraine. There they used to have rallies where they'd put up huge banners in the streets saying "Mova еднає нас," which means language unites us in Ukrainian. But actually, some Western Ukrainians, I would say, use language to divide people much more so than to unite them. I mean, even when they realize you're a foreigner who's recently arrived in the country, so you have no realistic hope of knowing Ukrainian because it isn't a global language. And when those people understand Russian perfectly and they know that you can speak it too, some of them just won't budge, And I know you've had this experience too, Scott.
In Western Ukraine, yeah, for sure.
So I mean, rather than put aside politics and just take the opportunity to communicate as human beings, they get all up in your face about it, and it alienates people, or at least it alienated me. I think places like Georgia, where you see the contrast, it really points out how immature some people's attitudes are in Western Ukraine. Only some, but a significant number, and it shows, I think, how some Ukrainians are really keen to emphasize differences and find reasons to disagree, rather than to focus on reasons to unite and put aside differences. And obviously, that it's not the only place in the world where that kind of thing happens. But we've seen the results of that. I mean, the country is now in a total mess, and we don't know what is going to happen there. Reportedly, the average salary now in Ukraine is only about $150 a month, and obviously that's not entirely because of what I've just said about language, but this desire to emphasize people's differences rather than to try to find common ground and just communicate as humans, I think is really a factor in the Ukrainian crisis. So that's just something I've been thinking about since I've been here, because it's just here it's just not an issue. People want to talk, so they'll talk in any language that both of you know. So I just thought I'd throw that in. What do you think about that?
I think it ties into the thing that we've often mentioned before, which is the team mentality of. It ties in with nationalism, desperately wanting to cling on to nationalism and cling on to language goes with that, and I think if people can let go of this idea that we need to be part of a team and people outside the team need to recognise we're a team, I think it all links into that, personally.
Yeah, I think so. It's in-group, out-group mentality, which is, usually the refuge of people who really don't feel they have a lot of, they don't feel a great sense of belonging in their lives in general. And another thing that I really noticed about Ukraine, though particularly now they will deny this strenuously, is that it isn't a community. There's no sense of community in Lviv, for example, none at all. Everybody is out for themselves and their clan, and that's all. Now, that's not universally true. There are a lot of very, kind people in Western Ukraine who will, reach out to almost anyone. But there are a lot of people who don't feel like that, and it prevents a sense of community from forming. And then you have to fall back on like I said, using things like language and culture and things like this to emphasize differences, and the results of that can be catastrophic, as I've seen in the last 12 months. So we talk a lot about Mr. Evil in the Kremlin, but and we talk about outside influences on the Ukrainian conflict and on many other issues, but I don't think you can lay the blame all in one place, and I think that. I think that there's a lot of social repair that needs to be done there.
There is definitely. I just wanted to, on a positive note, say that go back to the hospital situation. That Ukrainians can be very hospitable. I mean, that's not to say that they're friendly to outsiders. I mean, when I was in hospital, the school I was working at would send a different person every day, and they'd be bringing food and taking care of me. So they're extremely hospitable as well.
Well, that is true as well. As I said, this is not a universal thing, but it's enough of a problem that it really needs to be addressed if the country does want to find some unity in the future and go ahead in a more constructive way without having a little war every time there is an election. Something really has to happen inside the country, and that will also, I think, provide some protection from these kind of corrosive outside influences?
I personally, I find it hard to be optimistic because I think something needs to change in the entire world, not just in Ukraine, because Ukraine is being pulled apart from the outside as well. You know, it's being tugged apart from the West as well. I think things need to change internationally, not just in Ukraine. I think we need to get countries that aren't trying to help pull other countries apart, like just happening in Ukraine. You know, Western influence is also making the situation even more difficult, and it's difficult to be optimistic when you've got all these world leaders, just these career politicians running the world. Because I don't think Ukraine's going to be better off in Europe, really. And it's not going to be better off with Russia. It'd be better off if countries looked after themselves and dealt with corruption, and it's difficult to imagine that happening really in Ukraine.
It is difficult. As I said though, I mean, Georgia is in some ways an inspiring example. They pulled out all the stops to rid their country of corruption, and now it's done. The work is done. So it's possible. I mean, people in other former Soviet countries, Kazakhstan, for example, say it's too big, it can't be done. It can be done, and it has been done. So,
I believe it can be done, but it needs someone in power, or it needs the people to demand it, basically. It either needs the people to demand it, or someone in power who's half decent, who wants to do it. That needs the will to do it, and I don't see it happening whilst we've got these kind of internationally we've got these people in power who don't have the desire to make the world a better place. But maybe it can change. I'm hoping that it can change somehow.
Well, I think, as I said, Georgia, although it's a country that's a long way from being out of the woods, I think has provided us with an example that I suppose justifies at least a little bit of hope.
Well, maybe it's because of the wine.
It could be.
Anyway,
in lieu of hope, there's always wine. Yeah.
There is, yeah. Thank you for joining us and giving us a bit of a background on the Georgian and Ukrainian situation, the comparisons, and we'll chat again soon on another topic.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to our next chat already.
Okay, excellent. Catch you later.
Okay, good night.